Hi, everyone. Welcome to our last DFP seminar of 2021. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful sunny day. My name is Jocelyn, and I'm the research facilitator at DFP. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. You might be calling in today from other sites around BC and maybe even further. I invite you to both introduce yourself and to share with us the territory from which you're joining us today. If you're not sure, feel free to use the link at the bottom of the slide here. I would like to acknowledge that DFP's offices and classrooms are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. To unpack some of this terminology, traditional recognizes lands traditionally used and or occupied by the Musqueam people or other First Nations in other parts of the country. Ancestral recognizes land that is handed down from generation to generation. Unceded refers to land that was not turned over to the Crown by a treaty or other agreement. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Professor and DFP member Julia Ballard.
I'm very happy to be able to introduce Dr. Sucheta Ghoshal today. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at University of Washington, which I hope is also having a lovely sunny day today. She joined HCDE at UW after completing her PhD in human-centered computing at Georgia Tech. And she has previous experience working at Wikimedia as a software engineer and a community organizer for Wikipedians in India. And Dr. Ghoshal's work spans research and activism with a focus on grassroots social movements and information communication technologies, which I believe is the focus of her talk today, with an eye toward how ICTs are part of a larger systems of oppression. The DFP committee has very much looking forward to hearing Dr. Ghoshal speak about this work because we want to form connections between DFP and HCDE at UW. So Dr. Ghoshal will begin her talk in a moment. Afterwards, we expect to have some time for questions. I can recognize a lot of student names in the participants today, so I'll make sure that we leave some time to hear your questions in particular. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ghoshal to take over.
Yeah, I'm trying to enable the screen sharing because I have some slides that I'd like to show you all. Let's see. Okay. Do y'all see the slides? Great, fantastic. And yes, we are having a sunny day for a change. It's been rainy and gloomy for what feels like forever now, but the sun came out. I am hoping and believing that it's for this talk, and also I have a root canal later today, so a very momentous occasion. Okay, great. So thank you for the introductions, Julia. I'm so happy to be here. I'm an assistant professor at the Human-Centered Design and Engineering Department at HCDE UW. I have been working with grassroots organizations in the US South and also in the Global South for many years now. And as Julia said, that I've also worked at the Wikimedia Foundation. My interests lie mainly at the intersection of community organizations that are questioning power structures. And especially, I try to understand how they relate to popular information communication technologies. And in this talk particularly, I'm going to share my experience of designing a critical technology practice with some of my doctoral work, as well as some of the work that is happening right now in my lab at HCDE. I want to share a little bit of the overall overview of this talk. I try to keep it as simple as possible, and it's not a very a scripted talk. I want to have a discussion around the ideas, some of the ideas that are still being formed, and our ongoing work that's happening in my lab. So with that being said, I'll start with a positionality and grounding, especially talking about where I stand in relation to the work that I do. I'll share a little bit of my past work, especially the construction of a theory that I use heavily in my current work, the theory of technocultural reproduction. And then I'll share my current work on critical technology practice and how I arrived at that, what I mean by that, and two projects in particular that are happening currently in the lab that are kind of following these same principles. So the work that I do is interesting and unique in the sense that I'm not only documenting or reporting from the field, I'm also taking myself, my whole individual, my whole self into some of these fields that I go to. And so therefore, I think my positionality becomes just as important as the findings and the data that I collect from the ground. To share a little bit about that, so about 25 years ago, I was standing in front of a construction site of a water reservoir that was being built for the service of a thermal power plant. My father, who was an electrical engineer for this thermal power plant, would often take us there. So we would often visit this stunningly beautiful and practical piece of technology, really, an artificially created water body that provided one of the main natural resources for producing electricity in this power plant. And we would stand there and observe and kind of watch the sunset on the water. And my father would remind us exactly how many indigenous villages had to drown to make this artificial water body possible. And this is true. This water reservoir was built at the cost of several hundreds of indigenous lives who were drowned to make this progress or beacon of progress possible. The promises that were made to these villagers were never fulfilled. There was no accountability whatsoever. They were displaced without any real means of accountability established and followed through. So it became sort of a ritual for us to go to the site of technological progress and sort of mourn the losses that made this artifact exist in this world. So growing up, I always encountered technology as this phenomenon that was always filled with tensions between progress and systemic exclusion. And I was emphatically told that our job as technology workers is to question any and every erasure that happens via technology. Now, as I shared in the beginning, kind of the timeline, I was about 6 years old. I had no idea what this meant, but the point of this story is that the first interaction that I ever had with technology that I can recall came to me as a complex phenomenon. It was never a simple story of progress. There was always something that was hidden, that was being invisibilized for creating the shine that came through with progress. And often these stories and realities that were being invisibilized were human stories of human life and human dignity and historically marginalized groups. And as an upper caste Brahmin person, I got to be at the side of progress in the sense that I was in the position watching this from the high up of, metaphorically and also literally looking at it from the side of progress and looking at what needed to be displaced to make progress happen. So this is, to say that I grew up in a very political household that never took our caste and class position as how it should be in this world. And this movement household also meant that, like we process hard truths with community. So from this childhood, I kind of grew up knowing two things to be true. One, that story of technology is complicated, and it's full of hard truths like this. And also you process hard truths with the help of community and people that surround you. In my later life, I became part of a different kind of community, the community of free and open source software. I became a software engineer in this community, and I was building language access for Wikipedia as a software engineer there. And simultaneously, I was trying to work towards building up a community of Wikipedians who were using my language Bengali as primary means of contributing to Wikipedia. Being in the free and open source software movement was one of the best things that happened to me in realizing how technology can happen or can be produced without making profit the primary motivation or the driving force. However, my identity in the free and open source community was not the common or the regular normal identity, right? So I was representing a minority, however privileged and a position that I was in my own community and the family and the movement community that I came from. I was positioning myself in the kind of the international community of free and open source software as a minority. And what that meant for positioning myself in this like complex identity that I held as a person, as a woman coming from India in the community that was predominantly white and Western, was that it revealed something really important about who gets to be critical of technology, who gets to imagine technology as something that happens without the primary goal of profit. And that really clicked something for me, especially it also made me see how technology was progressing in my surroundings in the global South, and how it was positioning itself as a position of as an object of power in everyday life. Particularly in 2014, the government of India started coming up with a lot of obscure technological policies. One highlight being Aadhar, the unique identification technology that was recording biometric and demographic data of residents. And you can imagine Aadhar as something sort of similar to SSN, but it had a lot of very critical security and privacy concerns. And also this was being deployed by a government that has a record of using personally identifiable data towards communal rioting ends against a lot of Muslim and poor people. And so with that context, even with that context where technology comes across as, or this technology comes across as evil, I think in reality, as it was presented to us, it wasn't as simple as just evil or wrong. See, it was presented to us with the political and technological rationality that biometric identification, or in other words, more accurate, authentic identification would lead to less corruption in welfare programs. What that means is that it would be more difficult to, enlist your pets, your goat, your non-human objects to enlist as a beneficiary for the welfare program. These are things that had happened in the past. But in reality, as this paper suggests, that attempts to reduce corruption in welfare programs can also generate non-trivial costs in especially in terms of exclusion and inconvenience to genuine beneficiaries. In many cases, that results in death of people who could not have the access or the ability to go through the whole, obscure process of identity verification with using complex technologies. So this leads us, I did a lot of organizing against this technology, but also like understanding how, people who were kind of at the other end of this technology, especially people from rural areas who may or may not have had any sort of prior experience with technology, let alone something as complex as biometrics, were reacting to this. And in often cases, people who were in the below or lower poverty level were being mandated to, enroll in this program, even if it's not as simple as like, there was no mandatory, it went through like a various stages of mandating it for people to enroll in this. But in most cases, it was for lower and below poverty level people who needed like any sort of subsidized food or welfare programs. They would have to have an Aadhar to get to that, to get to something that was basic human right. And so this kind of reveals something really important, I think, that is at the core of this tension that I started talking about from the beginning of this talk. The who gets to be human in the ideas of progress that often our nation states and our markets follow. Be that technological or human, the ideas of progress that we often have to follow consider and allow only a few people to be human, and kind of leave the rest of the people marginalized and invisibilized for the most part. This is kind of the context that I wanted to set for the work that I will present now from my doctoral dissertation work. I'm gonna share only a very small part of the whole dissertation work that I did with particularly the movement communities from the US South. But just to say that, like, setting in this, grounding myself in what I knew from the Global South organizing space, I came to the US South to kind of find answers or question the same thing with the people who have been questioning this core tension between human progress and systemic exclusion, particularly Black organizing communities in the US South that have been constantly demanding an expansion in the definition of human and who gets to be human. It really is a simple question that led them to discover and uncover a lot of different critiques of technology that I grew up reading and knowing about, and I wanted to see firsthand how that plays out in the epicenter of Western capitalist ideal in the United States. Which led me to form a relationship with the Southern Movement Assembly, my primary movement community, my movement family at the moment, and to say a little bit about them, because this work would not be possible at all without the work and their existence in this planet. The Southern Movement Assembly is a regional movement of about 110 different organizations from all over the US South. And what they're trying to do is to build up a regional movement across these different local organizations that are still working in their localities in different parts of the South. It is primarily led by people that have lived through Black political tradition, the civil rights era, and it is kind of drawing from that wisdom that comes from those traditions and political realities of those times and political beliefs of those times. And it's trying to also conceptualize a new way of being for a lot of people who have been living in segregated ways for a very long time. But that being said, what I want to give you now is like a brief overview of what that means in the day-to-day lives of these organizers and how they encounter technology at all in this work that they're doing for grassroots organizing. So in 2017, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, and that was the beginning of a huge environmental as well as political crisis for a lot of people. And in 2018, a local grassroots organization in Puerto Rico organized an intensive, and a lot of people from all over the South, about 20 people from all over the South, who all had various degrees of experiences with climate disasters on their own. They were from places and spaces that have been affected by climate crisis in the past, went to Puerto Rico to help them, help this organization, moving forward and building up from what was lost. And that kind of led to, a work or political analysis such as this that talks about how the crisis that was unfolding in Puerto Rico was not just a crisis of environmental crisis, but it was also a political crisis in capitalism that has been in the works for a very long time. It also meant like working quite physically in the community gardens that was trying to help with these people and their sustenance with locally grown food. And it also meant coming together and sharing life experiences and findings, the healing and restoration from this really huge devastation that was following them through the experience of the hurricane. So people coming together, sharing life experiences and forming a regional identity as well as a regional consciousness of what they're facing is not magic. It happens through critical resources and because of critical resources that they have organized for a very long time. It happens because of people and relationships. As a friend of mine, as well as a fellow organizer, often says that we cannot do this alone and we do not want to. And so the grassroots approach really is explained in this simple sentence, right? It talks about how the grassroots approach is both at once a practicality and a desire. We cannot do this alone, and that is just the truth. It is a practicality, but we don't want to speaks to this desire that we have to be part of something broader. We want to be part of something large, something connected, something inclusive, something that speaks to many people, even if it doesn't speak to me individually. And the spirit of grassroots work gets at this really fundamental critique of individualistic capitalist ideal that, especially in the legacy that it has in Black US South, gets to this critique against individualistic values and ways of being. On the other side of the story is that this work happened with the use of many popular technologies that often do not share those same values, same critiques of corporate modes of production. But the group still depended on these same information communication technologies like Facebook or Google Drive or different graphic softwares. And interestingly, what that means is that despite the dependence that grassroots organizing has on ICTs, especially grassroots organizations around the Black US South, they are still fundamentally at odds with the culture of ICTs. And my work, my past work at least, has been at this position, at this like complex socio-technical reality of what it means to depend on technologies that you fundamentally disagree with as far as their values and politics goes, and how that has real consequences for the culture that they're trying to maintain and build for years now. To do this work, I chose emancipatory action research as my primary mode of inquiry, which advocates for understanding and situating myself closely in a grassroots community rather than observing it from a distance and taking a political stance and simultaneously studying the use of technology. What I did more concretely in the field was I did several, obviously, like I kind of embedded myself in the community. I have been a community organizer all my life. And so my primary connections in the field formed through the community organization commitments that I share. And that kind of led to research, forming of research questions, and then kind of sharing what my research agenda was in the community in the academic community that I was representing, and sharing that with my community partners and getting their approval, getting their consent for interviews, conducting several participatory workshops that were sort of building on to the methods that they were already familiar with. I drew from different analytical methods, starting from reflexivity and using my positionality, seeing how that impacted the way I was seeing my findings. I also engaged with several different theories, which, I'll share a little bit about the technocultural theory that I used in this talk, but I drew from several different social and political theories that were, engaging with technology in the same light. And throughout it all, I also designed several technologies or tools with the community, kind of towards the exploration of what we were trying to do. It ranged from quote unquote high-tech technologies like, building up a communication platform to, again, quote unquote low-tech technologies like handbooks, zines, and all, and had like various degrees of success with technology development. I mean, technology really like getting the use that we hoped it would have. And that's, that we kind of used that kind of feedback from the community as a primary source of what technology meant for these people. So building with them as well as getting their feedback on what we were building was really key in understanding how technology and its values and its culture was received in the people and their everyday use. So in 2017, I attended a meeting of the SMA and kind of understood a lot about their values, their cultures, and as well as like the technologies that they were using. Like most community organizations, SMA was making use of built a sort of an ecosystem of different technologies, popular technologies like Facebook for kind of outreach and recruitment purposes. They use Zoom heavily. This was a regional movement that depended a lot on virtual communication and meetings over online means. They had a website which was built at first with the help of a tech collective, a radical tech collective called May 1st. Some of you may know their existence. And then later on, they had to move towards a more corporate collective, or not even collective, like a more corporate interface that had better management. That's a different story altogether, which kind of the tensions that I capture in this work. If anybody wants to talk about that more, I'll be happy to share that as well. And they had several different like physical artifacts as well that was a part of the socio-technical ecosystem that they had built already. And one of the things that I did in that meeting was to commit to building or building up and maintaining a communication working group that will, share a lot of the responsibilities of maintaining this technological ecosystem, maintaining this infrastructure that they had already created and improving on it. And also, like, beyond helping with the technical needs, we would also try to understand how politically, how these technologies were helping or not helping in furthering the means of the community organization. So, for example, during a meeting in rural Mississippi, organized by one of the SMA partners, we realized that the lowest registration count was from the people and the communities in the rural Mississippi who were supposed to be at the center of the activities. And later in that meeting, we further realized that there were several people attending the meeting who did not have the means for registration, because the registration was primarily done through several tools that were completely out of reach for a lot of these people who did not have stable internet connection or did not have a smartphone service at all. So this was kind of a really an important learning moment for both the communication working group that I was trying to build up, as well as the entirety of SMA, where we had to kind of look inwards and discuss and reconcile with the fact that the very people that we wanted to center were getting alienated by the use of technologies that we were choosing or having to depend on. And from that point onward, SMA wanted to work towards a cohesive communication practice across the movement that addresses incidental exclusions like this. And we realized at this point that there was probably more to the conflict between grassroots movements and technologies. And it became clearer also that it wasn't going to get solved with the next big technology or next big innovation that we do that looks fancy and looks shiny. And no matter how technically value sensitive or value centered the next technological solution is, there is always going to be a fundamental conflict between technology and the popular culture of technology and the culture of grassroots movements. And so that kind of led us to, commit to the work of reflecting on the relationship between the SMA as well as the technologies that they were using. I'll be walking you through the ways we approached the share goal and what we learned from that. Starting with doing several interviews and like informal meetups and conversations with a lot of people from various positions in the SMA power structure. Like, obviously it is kind of a non-hierarchical organization, but at the same time, there are hidden power hierarchies in every organization. And I kind of tried to map that as well as like understand experiences of technology from different positions of power. For a lot of people, the culture of SMA meant a culture of collectivity, a culture of communality. For a lot of people, this meant that going against or sort of taking a stance against the segregated ways of living that you don't realize until you be in a space with a lot of people around you and realize how much you share with them. It also meant that they needed to create almost a prototype for what an alternative future could be like that doesn't represent or resemble the same power structures that they were fighting. And so it was very important for these movements to have a different culture than the culture that institutions in power often have. On the other hand, when we discussed the experience of technology, I got like very different answers from people at different ends of technological experiences, really. So for a lot of people who were maintaining some of these technologies like Google Drive or administrating the Facebook account, they'd say that like majority of SMA was hostile towards the use of technology, and hostility was a word that was used a lot. On the other hand, when I talked to like rural people in the South, they talked about how online campaigns and online uses, online meetings make them feel isolated. and how they thought that they matter just as much as the rest of the community, and therefore like making technological decision based on who has access has a real flaw. They also were very worried that the community as a whole was starting to overvalue technology and undervalue the importance of relationship building, and relationality has been a core value of Black radical tradition for forever. And so this posed as a real threat. They also talked about how it was difficult to think about technology, no matter how much they try to represent their values, without thinking about stolen innovations from their people and how it has always meant power that they did not have. Really, what this meant was that in SMA's expectations, more information communication technologies like Facebook or any sort of popular technologies that promise to solve the social problem meant more relevance among young people, more inclusion, more efficient organizing, more funding. In reality, however, majority became intimidated by technology, threatened by technological means of organizing, and technical competence was often associated with whiteness and wealth. And then technically competent people ended up having more power, evidently. One example of this playing out is, for every community meeting had to have a note taker, because again, like coordination happened mostly over Google Drive. And every meeting would have the note taker who was white and had this set of represented wealth and racial privilege that most of the community did not have. And this individual was definitely not on board with this idea either. However, because they had a laptop and they could type very fast. So skills in ownership of artifacts such as these started to shape how the organization, how the community was functioning as a whole, even though they did not want that to happen themselves. I tried to make sense of this phenomenon, all of my findings, with the use of technocultural theory by Arnold Pacey, because technology having cultural implications and changing a culture as a whole is not new. And Pacey talks about this a lot. And one of the ways Pacey talks about this is that he talks about how technology is often seen as in its restricted meaning and just the artifact, and the meaning of just the artifact. But technology should be actually seen as broader than artifact, and artifacts and the technical aspect of technology is often an expression of the cultural and the organizational means that create the technology. This has been, reformulated with a lot of new ideas, and especially with introducing ideology is another parameter in this. And I borrow a lot from Andre Brock's work, who have used Arnold Pacey and technocultural theory and reformulated it as artifacts, practices, and beliefs as a triad that represent technology and its whole picture. And this diagram sort of says that in this view, the artifacts that the Southern Movement Assembly was using really the artifacts are just a small piece of the puzzle. The artifacts are often the expressions of the beliefs and practices happening in the corporations and the sites of production that they're coming from. And often they are the cultural expression of these corporate practices. The culture of these corporations and the sites of production are well documented. And we have seen steady patterns of racial, class, and gendered exclusions happening in these mega big tech corporations. What that means is that what I was seeing in SMA and in its culture was a direct reflection of how they were made, the technologies were made. So technical competence being associated with whiteness, masculinity, and wealth or capital, as well as technically competent people ending up with more power, is not something that was happening it was not a new or a novel phenomenon that was happening only in the SMA. It was really a reflection of something broader, something cultural, something systemic. My analysis suggests with this theory of technocultural reproduction that while the grassroots movements and their culture have pretty much nothing in common with the sites of production that we are looking at, they do have the artifacts in common. And so therefore, using artifacts that were made through these years of cultural domination meant that the values in these artifacts often reproduce and create the same sort of inequalities that they were made and marketed with. This was kind of a turning point in our relationship with technology, and we started to pretty much imagine what a different technology practice would look like. How can we use not like completely stop using the same artifacts, because again, we had to be strategic about like our use of technology, but how do we incorporate different skills and practices that we can claim as our own, and kind of have a broader vision of technology in the community itself. It meant practically doing a lot of like community circles, we call them communication circles, workshops in different rural points, places, including Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama. We went to these places and started talking about technology, the feelings and reactions people had about technology, not just information communication technology, but like any technology as a towards the goal of expanding the definition of technology. We kind of started recording reactions of any and every technology, including a pen or a telephone of any kind. We also developed a movement artifact that was sort of presented and created with the same spirit of zines and movement handbooks that they already had. And that documented a lot of the history of how information communication technologies became a thing in the Southern organizing practices at all. So to situate technology as we know now as a thing that has been in the making for a long time, and people who now feel alienated by technology have been in the process of critiquing as well as engaging with technology, with use and non-use for a very long time. It really at the end meant that how could we reframe refusal to use popular technology not as deficiency, but as legitimate critiques of white capitalist and often carceral and anti-Black technoculture. For a lot of people, not using Facebook when we started talking really meant that they were afraid of using technologies that resembled that high sense of surveillance and keeping tabs of one another, because they get stopped all the time at signals and get searched by the police. And so technology was an artifact that represented policing and surveillance more than it represented emancipation or liberation. So with that logic, really the refusal to use or get on board with like popular new technologies like Facebook or Google Drive is real. Like the refusal is coming from a place of critique, of critical analysis really of the white capitalist and often carceral and predominantly anti-Black technoculture that these technologies represent. I tried to, with the community, we tried to kind of position technology as this political and cultural artifact that is something to be critiqued and critically engaged with, rather than intimidated by or like how to like insert the agenda of critically engaging with technology as a part of the movement agenda was something that we worked on from then on. And it really led us to beautiful discoveries, like how the community has always believed in novel innovations of technology that came from their culture. Technologies like being able to build community while being forced or having community dismantled around you constantly. And so technology in this new sense in the community meant more than just information communication technologies. We identified food as a core technology that this community was have been driven by for years. And how do we place that in the front and center of our analysis and go from there was the challenge we sort of took on together. We tried to do this with kind of reframing how social media or like popular new technologies can be a small part of our overall technological goals, created a new infrastructure. But more importantly, we placed grassroots technology practice as a resistance against whiteness and as technology. This was our conceptual framing. What this means in my vision is that I draw a lot from Wendy Chung's framing of race and as technology. Seeing whiteness as well as capital and technology, like framing this as and technology, gives us an understanding of how technology, or how whiteness and capital and technology impact each other's logic and development. It also reveals the patterns and similarities that make whiteness as well as capital pose as technology on their own at times. Leading me to kind of develop the current work that I'm doing, and I'll be brief in this section because it's still ongoing, and I just want to share a little bit of what this is about. Framing critical technology practice as something that is extending grassroots technology practice, but also adding more critical theories of whiteness, gender, sexuality towards public infrastructures of resistance and accountability towards information communication technologies is something that I'm doing. And this agenda is not new. Phil Agre talked a lot about critical technical practice, and I'm kind of like trying to extend that agenda with the work that I'm doing. And the core research questions that are currently now driving me here are, what would it take for us to build technologies of resistance in the face of the many global crises that we are facing, and how to best locate technology in these intersecting forces of harm, and what comes after this analysis. Leading me to start the lab that I have at HCDE called Inkilab. It's inspired by the Urdu phrase Inkilab Zindabad, that has been a popular slogan used by Indian freedom fighters. It means long live the revolution. The two main threads that we are kind of focusing on right now in the lab are understanding power and governmentality and relational organizing from local to transnational. Towards the governmentality and understanding the logics of power that lead to technological progress. I'm doing a community-centered study on mobility infrastructure for the city of Seattle. And then this work kind of is happening in collaboration with Collaborative Systems for Security, Safety, and Regional work. And the other side of this is understanding how we can make infrastructures of transnational solidarity possible. And towards that end, I organized with Khadija Abdurrahman from We Be Imagining the summer program called the Otherwise School, which had the goals of decentering Western knowledge and centering Southern knowledge, both global as well as the US South, and understanding how to place intersectionality and Black feminist thought at the front and center of this goal, as well as establishing abolition as a methodology. Really, the goal of this has been kind of driven by and inspired by the work of Catherine McCrittick and other critical Black thinkers, and really thinking about how the work of physically refusing to the limiting understanding of colonial space-time that we are in is a critical agenda for now. And really, I would like to end with the thought that despite all the logics of eraser that technology is built with, we are still here. We exist in the excess of language that are used, language and as well as technology and designs that are used to justify our terror. And I want to continue, claiming our space in this mess.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghoshal. It's a wonderful talk.
Thank you again, Dr. Ghoshal, for a wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope everyone gets a chance to get outside and enjoy the sunny weather. Thanks again. Bye.